And we are live. Hello, this is Owen Macdonald. Would you like to... Did I pronounce that correct, by the way?
That was all correct, yes.
All right. Yeah, because us Americans don't know how to pronounce anything correctly.
Well,
We're stuck in that old accent with the rhetoric R.
I mean, I've got a Welsh first name and a Scottish surname, so I like to think
Oh,
that
my first name comes... my actual first name comes from Welsh lore.
Oh, okay.
Welsh folklore. Yeah, so this is Owen Macdonald. Right now I am looking at his Twitter description. A socialist, Marxist, feminist, so cultural Marxism, apparently. No.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, anyone who's left of Republican is a cultural Marxist, so,
Yep.
you know.
Yeah, anybody left of the Republican Party. Yeah. Even the Democratic Party is cultural Marxism, even though they're still right wing. And
Exactly.
anyone left of Ayn Rand's right ovary.
Well, exactly.
No, but yeah, we definitely. Funny enough, I meant to think of some topics, but I ended up coming up blank. But Owen was able to think of some topics.
Yeah, I mean, I have capitalism, socialism, anarchism, or look at the differences between the forms after capitalism, Trump, and then a few more I thought of were just on the general anti-feminist vibes on YouTube and social media, and on things in general within, I guess, like within feminism and stuff. So
yeah. Well, this guy is proof that feminism is cultural Marxism. I'm always going to say that just because it really I know a lot of people on the right like to say that, to throw that term around, despite the fact that the term, even when it was made up by the Frankfurt School, was meant to be a joke.
Well,
I mean, they use it about as much as they use the word cuck.
Yeah. It's the lack of understanding around Marx I find to be fascinating from people who are taught to be the people who claim they're intellectual and they make up these lies about a man they've never read the works of or even remotely studied.
No, you don't. This is cultural Marx. He was the dictator of Soviet China. He killed, and his satanic dialectics killed 683 billion people.
Well, exactly. I mean, Karl Marx, he personally sold them himself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've always found Marx to be an interesting read. I mean, in many of his readings, at different points in his life, he even contradicts views that he had had previously. I mean, it's not just a man who had one view throughout his whole life and never changed his mind on anything and didn't think about anything.
Well, exactly. He was a very complex and interesting man. His works can be quite in depth, I find. Sometimes it can be quite rich material to read, so you have to really go into it. But it's definitely worth going over because there's a lot of important stuff in there. And to me, it's quite astounding how relevant it is, despite the fact it was written 200 years ago, nearly.
Well, I mean, also a lot of the people who basically use the word Marxism to mean socialism don't have this understanding that socialism was not something created by Marx, and Marx was not, that socialism and other forms of socialism do predate Marx himself.
Yeah.
So basically saying Marxism as a synonym to socialism is kind of inaccurate.
Well, exactly. I mean, it stems from the confusion around ideas against capitalism. I mean, socialism in itself was described by Marx as a step towards communism rather than the same thing as socialism and communism. From humanity's perspective, because it's so far left of what capitalist ideology presents itself as, you end up with a situation where it's all lumped together.
It's a bit like what Noam Chomsky says, where both parties are team business, and
Well, exactly.
Both parties are taking business. It's just one is for so basically you have the choice between social progress or social regress. I
Well,
mean,
exactly. I mean, even with the Democrat Party, though, we've seen their policies haven't always been
very,
that
yeah.
helpful. I don't know if you saw. I saw a tweet by John Iadarola, where he literally just said Jesus Christ, and it was a clip from the Democrat National Congress clip, and it's some guy saying, "Oh, I'm going to show the business executives how they can make more money if they vote Republican, and how they're going to give money back to us too." And it's like that's all you need to know about the state of some of the Democrat Party. Like they're very much a right-wing party.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like even today, the Democratic Party is still very much a right-wing party. As much as a lot of conservatives want to make it out like it's a communist Marxist party, it's really not. I
Well,
mean,
exactly.
communists, socialists, anarchists, Marxists, just general leftists are always critical of the Democratic Party. As
Well,
the Republican Party drifts farther right, so does the Democratic Party.
yeah.
And I mean, in a way, like while I don't like Cenk Uygur very much, at the same time, I kind of agree with him when he says the Democrats don't know how to play politics, where if they go farther right, you should go farther left. Of course, to him, farther left just means more social progress. I mean, to an extent, like if you have someone like I've basically said that if I was a politician and my opponent was voting to ban abortions, I would start advocating for partial birth abortions, like just to be like contrarian to him. Like just so that there's a polar opposite to try and bring the Overton window at least
So
somewhere near the center.
you think that it's important to have dialectic opposition to any right wing or far right stance, regardless of what it is?
Yes, I do. I
Well,
think that having some kind of dialectic stance to the some kind of dialectic stance to contrary to a far right stance is something that needs to exist. You shouldn't just the far right shouldn't have to, or the far right shouldn't have ownership of the Overton window.
exactly.
They
Like,
keep
you
farther to the
can't
right. They keep dragging what's considered rational discourse farther to the right,
like
and that's kind
you can't let people on the far right dictate political discourse, as you said. Like otherwise, you end up with more concessions to their ideology and obviously a lack of social progress. But coming back to
well.
what
I
you
mean,
said,
a great example is Obamacare, for example, which also wasn't actually called Obamacare when it was written. It was called the Affordable Health Care Act, or there was actually even more to it than that. But while the original goal was to ask for universal health care for single payer, what happened was Obama changed it to public option, which public option might have been the compromise in between what we had. But when he went and said public option, he got nothing. He just got smacked around by the Republicans, and they said no. They whined like little babies, and they said no.
well,
No health care for the poor. Fuck the poor.
well, I mean, it's deeply ingrained in the American political system to never have any sort of socialist leanings or policies that lean more towards a benefit of the many viewing. Coming back to what you said about the Democrat Party, you look at a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who at best is a left-leaning social democrat. He's advocating for things which are normal in many European countries,
Yeah.
and
He's
he's
bare
kind of
social democrat. He's kind of bare bones progressive. I mean, if you look at it, he is very dead center in the grand scheme of things. But we've gone so far to the right in this country that is seen as like a Marxist revolution.
yeah.
Like, oh no, we're gonna have the USSR again, which it's like, while I do think the USSR was horrible in many ways due to a lot of the suppression of the population in the USSR, at the same time, I think this idea that somehow, like, if the USSR was so bad and you think that it was so bad, why are you afraid that it's going, like, especially a lot of these people on the right, like, not the far right, just the right in general, and how even, like, the people in the center seem to think that good idea, like, part of the reason they tend to be opposed to Antifa has to do with the fact that they believe that good ideas will inherently take root while the bad ideas will kind of be squashed out. Of course, World War II is a great example of that not happening. Fascism was not a good idea. It was eventually stomped out, but not after it got to kill, not after it got to attempt an ethnic cleansing, killing 6 million Jewish people
Yeah.
and killing 11 million people total.
Well,
You know,
I think the USSR it sort of lost its way pretty quickly after the revolution happened. I mean, you look at there was a civil war, there was a famine, the Bolshevik Party went through a lot, and then Lenin, when he died, instead of transcending power to fellow like Marxists and people who actually shared his view of how the country would be run, it fell to Stalin, and it's quite clear to anyone with any sort of political knowledge that Stalin was not of the same line of thinking as his predecessors, given the fact that he literally purged the party of any Bolsheviks, and his main opponent had to flee to Mexico and was eventually assassinated in Trotsky. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, Stalin was essentially just a dictator. He was a totalitarian leader.
He borrowed policies from fascism to run the USSR whilst calling it communism. And that should tell anyone that his using the USSR as, oh, you can't have socialism or you can't not have capitalism because that's what happens. Anyone saying that is, I think, ill-informed. Then coming back to what you were saying about stomping out fascism, you're completely right. I mean, World War II is a very good example of why you can't just peacefully disagree. And in fact, in the Weimar Republic, the government laughed off the idea of Hitler rising to power. When they put him in prison, they thought that would be the end of it, and they kept saying that until he eventually became the president, or the chancellor even. And even then, they were saying, "Oh, well, we won't have him any power; he'll be fine." And then, obviously, the Reichstag fire happened. They got
but you don't get it. You don't get it. The crap. I always laugh when I say this. If Neville Chamberlain had tried to compromise with him, nobody would have died in World War II. Oh wait, no. Neville Chamberlain tried to appease him and was disgraced.
Well, exactly. Like, and whilst I'm not a fan of Winston Churchill at all. I think he's a vastly over-celebrated figure, but his stance on his attitude towards Hitler was very important. I think that was quite important for fighting, and it was good to see that it wasn't appreciated, tolerated. I mean,
also looking at what he thought was like, I don't mean to like go off topic too much, but just a little sidebar here. Winston Churchill, what he thought socialism was essentially what the right wing thinks socialism is today. And at the same time, he was also a hypocrite because of how much he taxed the citizenry of Britain at the time. I'm not saying that there wasn't a necessity for that tax, because it was clearly wartime and they needed to make sure that they could fund their military to have the war. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that it was simply hypocritical based on what he tries to say socialism is, and tries to say that it's horrible, but at the same time implements exactly what he thinks socialism is.
Yeah. Well, the misconceptions around socialism were already essentially as soon as the revolution in Russia happened, the sort of propaganda campaign against it started pretty quickly, because the elites and the capitalist class realized quite quickly that if they didn't put a press down on socialism, then they would end up having a similar overthrowing that as what we saw it to the Tsars in Russia. And definitely you look at what happened in America following the war with McCarthyism and the eradication of anyone who was left, really, and that sort of marred US politics to become one of purely right-wing ideology. And especially when you look at the country, it's not really a party for the people, as we see in other countries. Like the Labour Party in the UK, for instance, until recently, had it in their.
It was a neoliberal well, it still is a neoliberal party, but they essentially were kind of doing what the Democrats did, where it was like basically slightly less right wing than the Tories.
Yeah, now they're very neoliberal, and they really haven't been very left wing for ages. But initially, in their constitution, it was written that the means of production were to be handed back to the workers. Whereas in America, there's not been that party. There's no party that speaks for the workers. Hence why
that hasn't existed.
Well, exactly.
Ever at any point. I mean, there are minor parties, but I mean, there's no major parties like that. But Labor is a much more major party than, I don't know, Socialist Party USA, for example, or Communist Party USA, which I think the Communist Party USA isn't quite as good as the Socialist Party USA, but the Socialist Party USA takes many different tendencies. Like one of the official tendencies is libertarian socialism, and I mean there are some like Leninist tendencies, but they have to like Leninists aren't outright banned, but at the same time it is very hard for them to get in because a lot of them have a bit. It's essentially, it doesn't line up with the like it doesn't I mean they do have some Leninists in there, but there's basically, they have to be like less sectarian. My experience with a lot of Leninists is that they can be very sectarian, and especially with anarchists, they can be very hostile towards them. But I mean, that's not always the case. But I mean, there's also, I mean, the libertarian socialism kind of goes against the democratic socialism, but I mean, it's basically meant to be kind of like left unity. I mean, I'm not a big fan of like left unity at all costs. Like the left can't criticize itself. Like we have to copy exactly what the fascists do so that we can beat the fascists. Like, I mean, even if we're not copying like their more bigoted stuff, just copying like the way that they think, copying like their kind of hive mind mentality. I mean, I definitely agree that there should be solidarity amongst the left as much as possible. But yeah, the idea that it's like you should be unified at all costs, even if you find someone on the left to be morally reprehensible.
Well, exactly.
I mean, if there's a leftist who supports NAMBLA, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, you're still a comrade. I mean, on a technicality, you are, because you're a communist if you are a communist who supports NAMBLA. But I mean, I'm going to find you disgusting, and I am going to try and avoid you as much as possible.
Well, exactly. I mean, being left wing is such a broad thing. You know, it's silly to just blindly say anyone who's left wing is my friend, because I mean, you would hope that you want to have to spend time with people with views like that in NAMBLA. But no, I think it's important to have discussions around what the future is, and just blindly saying not capitalism is all right for a bit, but then once you think about it, it becomes unhelpful because you don't know where you progress. Do you abolish the state? Do you continue the state but just entirely centralized? Like, where do you go? So it's important to have internal debate and outward debate about where the future lies. But I would say that
for Marxists too, it also depends on how far in the future. I mean, when it comes to the ideas behind socialism, it has always been to at least eventually get rid of the state, to eventually abolish the state. Doesn't necessarily mean right away. And I mean, even anarchists, there's like this misconception that they want to just abolish the state right away.
Yeah.
It's more that we want to try and handle them at the same time as much as possible because we are critical of both the state and capitalism. Well, we're more than critical of capitalism, but we're very critical of the state and we're very critical of centralized power.
Well, exactly. Like, well, I'm not an anarchist myself, but anarchy isn't about like people. I think people just think of like burning down cities, like tossing away everything, and like returning to just isolated communes and stuff with like no outward communication.
But that's fun. That's fun. It's fun to burn down buildings. Fun to burn down whole cities. Like I've heard some people claim that Black Lives Matter did in Baltimore. They burnt down all the cities. No, they didn't. They clearly did not burn down all the cities. They did not burn down Baltimore. There were a couple of rioters who burnt down buildings. But I mean, also at the same time, as an anarchist, can you really expect me to cry about a Starbucks window getting smashed by Black Bloc? Do you really expect me to go like, tisk, tisk? No, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to break the windows that are going to be replaced, because property, essentially, property is seen as more valuable than people in a capitalist system. And the people who own means of production are seen as even more valuable than the property itself.
Yeah. It's like you're asking to spare empathy for someone's like some multi-billionaire with their like shareholders at their window.
Okay, yeah. It's like, I mean, hashtag window lives matter. Am I right? I mean, that's I swear that's like what the right is like a lot of the times, where it's like they smashed windows and that's bad. You have to tell them to stop.
Well, it stems from a deep-rooted fear, doesn't it, of the people rising up, because they realize that if the system is questioned and too many people start to oppose the norms and oppose the capitalist system, then they'll lose their power because they're relying on the workers doing their bidding. And if too many start to question that process, then all of a sudden their control and assertion disappears. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, even in the U.S., I mean, while there has never been a major socialist party, there have been socialist movements that had significant parts of the country behind it. A great example is the Haymarket Affairs. There were plenty of, that was basically run by socialists and communists. I mean, there were definitely some liberals and progressives who just wanted better conditions, but there was definitely a bit of a socialist movement. I mean, the socialist movement are the ones who threatened FDR to a point where he decided to sign the New Deal. The New Deal was not made up by, I mean, a lot of liberals like to tout FDR as like this magical savior of the U.S. He did the New Deal all by himself. No, he didn't. What had happened is that basically socialists and communists had basically said, if you don't make these concessions and you don't give us these rights, we're going to turn this place into the USSR, into another USSR. And that scared enough of that scared about like half of FDR's like billionaire buddies to the point where they decided to give in. And then the other half just started to make right-wing propaganda that led into the era of McCarthyism.
Yeah.
Fun stuff.
Well, exactly. Like, I mean, as good as FDR was, it's important to remember that no president is just some like individual like signing away bills, and there's always going to be lobby groups and pressure. And the influence that the left had on these states at the time was profound and hugely important for the people of the country. And I think people should remember that when they slate left-wing ideas, because a lot of it is going to be just ideas that have helped their own lives, like we saw with what influenced the New Deal. And with, I suppose, the post-war president, I think, has probably been the most successful, Vietnam War aside, was Lyndon B. Johnson for his Big Society programs, which says a lot because he wasn't particularly good. But the fact that he
he was also still racist despite signing the Civil Rights Act.
He like appeased his.
He at one point, at one point he called, and I am going to be quoting a slur here. He basically referred, when talking about MLK, he referred to MLK as a nigger agitator.
Yeah.
That's clearly not someone who was like, he wasn't someone who was for civil rights the whole time. And
exactly.
But the signing of the Civil Rights Act was definitely an important bill.
Absolutely.
Definitely for example, looking at you look at the bill, it essentially caused it was significant enough that it caused a permanent political realignment, where before neither of the parties actually were specifically liberal or conservative, because there was a mix of both in both parties.
Yeah.
But essentially, the racist whites in the South, who had voted Democrat, basically realigned with Republicans, and then you got the liberal Republicans who realigned with the Democrats.
Yeah.
And you got a somewhat of a political realignment. I know that it's definitely a very bourgeois realignment. Like, these weren't like, it wasn't like communists were suddenly part of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
There are probably some communists who vote for the Democratic Party as like a point of damage control, but never really out of this idea that a Democrat is going to save everything.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Obama's dialectics aren't going to save us all.
Well, yeah, lots of people on the left who do vote will just think, oh, well, who's the least right wing, and just vote for them. And going back to Martin Luther King for a second, he was a socialist himself. So perhaps it's telling that arguably America's greatest civil rights campaigner was an opponent of capitalism.
Yeah, a great thing too is that something that people seem to forget is that when he was assassinated, he was doing class struggle activism. He wasn't doing black activism. However, he was still doing that, but I'm saying, like, specifically, he was assassinated while he was on a class struggle campaign.
Exactly. If you look at all the greatest civil rights campaigners and celebrated figures, they all tend to be quite left-leaning. Like, you look at someone like Nelson Mandela, the world authorities were all saying, oh, we're really sad about his death, he was such a great man, when 20 years ago there were people calling him a dangerous commie. We knew he was a communist, but they were the hypocrisy of the world's governments when criticizing him.
Well, it's like the Tea Party has semi-successfully co-opted Martin Luther King. They try and play the, like, Martin Luther King totally would have been he totally would have been in the Tea Party because look at his kids. His kids happen to be more conservative. Therefore, MLK was a conservative because he was a Republican, even though he was a Republican during the time when it was like when it was the party of Lincoln.
Yes. Well, exactly.
When it was the party of social progress.
Yeah, like, they take their ideas about being a Republican from like the 1800s, and it's like, oh, well, Democrats were racist back then, so why are you voting for them? Vote for us. It's like, well, that's such a, not only is your argument wrong, But
It's
one
about
maybe,
racist now.
yeah,
It's clearly like it's about who's racist now, and the Republicans are racist now, while the Democrats aren't. Or well, they still are to an extent, but they're not as outwardly racist as the Republican Party, which has started to been like the Republican Party has been cozying up to white nationalists recently. I mean, look at the victory of Trump. You could basically white nationalists managed to get their candidate into the presidency.
well, exactly. They
They
use Trump as a
gave,
stew, and then through that coercion of populism, were able to win an election. And now the senior legislative positions are filled with white nationalists, white supremacists,
yep,
and pseudo fascists, and probably eventually actual fascists.
yeah, yeah. Where, I mean, I've basically said that while I don't think Trump is going to like turn us into like Nazi Germany, at the same time, I'm kind of scared that like if Richard Spencer decides to run in 2024 or 2020, that like who's to say he doesn't get voted for, and that the skeptic community goes, but he's just satire and he's just joking and he's just joking and he's being edgy, bro.
Mm.
I
Well, I
mean,
mean, the reaction of that community to this whole transition of events has been quite telling, really. But I think that you're very right in saying that whilst Trump himself, I don't think he's a Nazi. I don't think Trump is a white nationalist. And
despite the fact that he is proud of his German blood and he talks about how he's got great genes, I don't think he's like a literal Nazi.
no, I mean, I think he's not himself like in possession of that ideology, but he's making motions to pass laws of the first stages of
Yeah.
fascism, and he's already cut out media that he doesn't like from briefings,
Yeah.
and yeah, maybe that's not exact, like it's not letting them print their stuff, but it's a step. Like you've not allowed the questions you don't like hearing to be answered. You
Yeah.
what else have you done? The
He's
obviously the Muslim ban is one, but again, if you can do that, then what else can you do? His senior officials aren't describing Islam as a
yeah.
religion, and thus it doesn't fall under protection of the constitution, so it will be easier to pass legislation to discriminate against them. Like
Yeah.
you've already seen the first steps towards more control and more.
I mean, he may not be a Nazi, but he is definitely showing indifference to Nazis.
Exactly, like he
I mean,
doesn't.
look at Steve Bannon, who was a chief editor for Breitbart, for example. Breitbart, which is essentially the like a white nationalist version of the Inquirer. Essentially, it's a white nationalist tabloid website. Essentially, like
Yeah.
it always has pandered to white nationalists, and now it just seems that your average everyday conservative is starting to pick it up too, and they're not getting the dog whistles that are in there.
Well, exactly.
They
Linking back to the skeptic community here for a second, like they're very quick to pounce on, oh, CNN is rubbish, the Huffington Post is rubbish, and yeah, they have their flaws. But what's more alarming is that the president and his associates take their news from Breitbart. And if you're that good a skeptic, you should be skeptically and analyzing Breitbart and how atrocious their articles are, and how easy it is
well, I
to
mean,
show how they're like false.
look at the difference between CNN and Breitbart. At least looking at CNN at least has sources. If you read a story from them, they have sources that can be verified or denied. And if you look at Breitbart, when they do have sources, a lot of the times these sources are misused or miscited.
Yeah.
So they're basically like an example that Sean and Jen did this, where they talked about fake news, and they showed basically that Breitbart, they covered this story about a German man. There was a shooter, and this man, after the shooting had happened, this man basically threw a bottle at him and hit him. And I mean, the gunman later went home and killed himself. But people were, but basically what Breitbart has said is that it's like, oh, this man is being charged. And this was 2 weeks after the original article had been posted, because if you actually look at the updates of what that article, or if you look at the updates on the event of that article, there was an account where someone basically had didn't have their chronology correct. So basically what they thought had happened was they thought that he threw the bottle first, then the shooter got set off. So they were worried that the guy may have instigated a shooting. And then as soon as the police got the correct chronology, they were like, oh, yeah, you're fine. We're not going to charge you with anything.
Yeah.
I mean, you say you want, especially conservatives, they're like, we want police to do their jobs. Well, the police were doing their fucking job in Germany. They were doing their job. They were following up on a lead that they had gotten that might have shown them, that might have given them information on what happened. And then basically the order of events, which got verified by more people, showed that the guy had done the shooting first, and then the guy threw the bottle at the shooter.
Well, exactly. I saw a similar Sean Jen video on the Quebec mosque shooting, and just how they went overboard with the it's a Muslim, and how the story just kept on changing to adapt to the Muslims were at fault, a narrative, and then when it
I think America now needs to build a wall at Canada because Muslims are coming over the border from Canada. I mean, the way that we talk, I have never heard of a more paranoid president than President Trump, and we had Bush in office. Although Bush was just an out-and-out liar. I mean, Iraq, they have weapons of mass destruction, and I mean, my position is that he knew he was lying.
Well,
I mean, CIA knew they were. There was someone who knew that they were lying, and I mean, Dick Cheney. All motives show that Dick Cheney, to some extent, had a reason to go in there. I mean, he had close relations with oil, being part of the industry himself before he was vice president.
Yeah.
So,
well, look at the company Bush kept: Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice. Like, these people, are out and out capitalist conservatives, and it's in their nature to do what's profitable for the US. So it was the weapons of mass destruction. Pretty quickly was found out to be a clear lie before we even went to war. And
we also have the same thing going on with Iran, although it's not necessarily for oil, but we're basically seeing that people are lying about them having weapons of mass destruction, when the whole point of the Iran nuclear deal was that they had already had enough nuclear material to proliferate nuclear weapons. Sorry, I can't speak today. To proliferate nuclear weapons, they had already had the tools for nuclear proliferation, and we basically, even though they weren't doing that, they were using it to get energy. They basically agreed to the Iran deal so that the U.S. wouldn't be hostile, because the U.S. has already fucked up Iran in the past. I mean, we're part of the reason they are the way they are now. I mean, in many ways, Red Scare politics played into the coup of 1953. I mean, Britain, literally, to get Eisenhower to help overthrow the Iranian government, he basically claimed that the Iranian government was communist. So, I mean, at first, Eisenhower had said no. And I mean, Eisenhower was also a famous president for the fact that for some of the stuff that he had said concerning the subject of the military-industrial complex, he was actually the one who basically coined the term. when he was leaving, where he basically was like, beware of the military industrial complex. But yeah, basically the word commie, and all of a sudden America's got its baseball bat like, we're gonna crack commie skulls.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the list of just American atrocities,
yeah, point us to the nearest commie.
Like, as soon as any potential threat to capitalist ideals comes into fruition, it's just send the FBI, send the army, disrupt everything. And the evidence of that is just the litany of deaths and carnage across Latin America, across Africa, across Middle East, across Southeast Asia, all because of the inherent need for more profit for the capitalist ideals. I watched a good video, the top 10 American atrocities abroad, I think, by libertarian
socialist rants.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually. Yeah, I watched that video, and that was where I learned a lot. I mean, that was basically like one of my starting points for knowing what America has done around the world. I mean, a lot of the things we've done to Latin America, especially in like the 80s. I mean, that like there are so many atrocities by the US that it's hard to keep track of them all. I mean, under Obama, we were at war in seven different countries. And these were not wars that were official on the books. These were just countries that we had occupation in, and that we had that we were sending soldiers in to do acts of war, but we didn't have the war on the books. I mean, but everybody knew that the war was going, that it was essentially the U.S. fighting a war without Congress actually going and approving the war. I mean, that, and I mean, also, to loop back to Bernie Sanders real quick, looking at Iraq, I mean, a lot of people like to talk about how, like Bernie would talk about how he voted against Iraq. And it's like, well, yes, he did, but he also voted after, while we were in there, to continue to fund Iraq. That is not a socialist thing. Socialists, I mean, socialists cite going into countries for business interests as like something that we do not want to do, like the exact fucking opposite that we want to do.
Yeah. Pretty obviously. But no, I think the on a wider talking point about the Middle East, I think the way to fix the problems there is to get rid of capitalism, because you look at how the Saudi Arabian government has benefited from US oil deals, and how it's been able to oppress its population with no real challenges because of the support it has and the way it maintains its power. And you realize that it's capitalism which enables this. Like, the people of the Middle East are not inherently like backwards people. You look at Iran and how they were moving towards a reform modern version of Islam, with like less far less cultural traditions thrown in that are oppressive. And then all of a sudden, like, US joint intervention, and we're back to a very traditional regressive idea of Islam and politics. And that's the same across the Middle East. Had we not had the ulterior motives for possessing oil and benefiting the economy of the US, then the Middle East would be a far easier place. Because you look at the Arab Springs, and it's clear that people want change, but because of capitalism, that change is highly unlikely to ever spring into fruition.
Well, I mean, just generally looking at, I mean, even beyond there isn't necessarily as much of a capitalist structure in these countries, but capitalism abroad exploits these countries just as it exploits any other country. I mean, look at the Congo. If it wasn't for capitalism, we would not have children in the mines in the Congo.
Yeah.
I mean,
look at Ghana, where because the they refused to meet some US privatization of the land demands. They put loads of embargoes on Ghana, and then the country fell into recession, and people starved to death. It's like
Yep.
they can claim all their morality and they can claim all their socialism and communism leads to famine, but capitalists are more than happy to famine to happen if it means they can save some profit and punish those who don't admit to their profit.
Yep.
And more, and obviously this doesn't get reported as much because it's damning to their own motives to criticize themselves. So the media won't report on that. And it's telling of capitalism.
Well, I mean, like a great example is while I am, of course, like not necessarily the biggest fan of Cuba, and I do think that there are many problems with Cuba. At the same time, people talking about how it's like failed and talking about like different countries failing because of socialism. They're not failing because of socialism. They're failing because of embargoes put on them based on the fact that they have shown support for socialism.
Well, exactly.
I mean,
like, Cuba itself is a complex and interesting country to discuss because whilst it isn't, it's not really like socialist. It's like authoritarian socialism, and there's not really workers don't really own the means of production. It's more Castro does, but it's not as simple as just socialism has kept them back. Like you said, like the US has essentially cut off Cuba from the rest of the world.
well, I mean, also just generally looking at Cuba, like they unlike many other countries actually managed to survive through their embargo and managed to grow. And like I said, there are definitely problems with the fact that the Castro family essentially owns the means of production. The government owns the means of production, not the citizenry, not the workers. They don't own the means of production.
Like there's no power transferred to the people at all. But then you can look at the elements of actual socialism that have been implemented. Look at the standards of healthcare in Cuba, which are like light years ahead of many Western countries.
Yeah.
Look at
people like to bring up that Castro and I think Che Guevara was like a horrible person. He was eager to like even like the people who he considered his comrades even said that like they thought he was way too eager to kill children and he was pretty bloodthirsty. But I mean, generally people like to bring up a lot of the Cuban revolutionaries were like massive homophobes. I mean, well, one, that's like trying to say that America, like if we had tried to make that point on America and say, well, capitalism is bad because American homophobia. I mean, like they'd basically look at us and say, well, that's not an argument. But it's like, oh, you can't like socialists because look, Castro was homophobic and he persecuted gay people. I mean, yes, he did, but at the same time, also gay rights came about sooner in Cuba than it did in America.
Well, exactly.
I mean,
like Castro got rid of the homophobic policies before the American government did.
Yeah, I mean, while Clinton and Obama were arguing that marriage is sacred between a man and a woman, in Cuba you were able to get a sex change free of charge.
Well, exactly. And then also, what other things are there? People live longer on average in Cuba, and they're happier on average in Cuba. And a really interesting stat I saw was when the Ebola crisis happened in Northern Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa rather, a few years back. Cuba sent more international aid than the US and the UK combined. And if that isn't damning enough on the state of capitalism compared to socialism, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, there's also problems like, I mean, America definitely has more freedom when it comes to art. Cuba had a lot of censorship of art. I mean, I can't necessarily blame them for not allowing American, like specifically American propaganda to get through. And I am not using propaganda in the liberal sense, which is that like, propaganda just means that it is inherently false, which is, I mean, as Noam Chomsky has put it, before the modern liberal usage of the word propaganda, people used to openly engage in propaganda, and they even said that it was propaganda. But now with the new liberal definition, where it's always meant to support, where it just means that it is inherently false, we still engage in propaganda. We just don't call it propaganda because it's now seen as a negative term inherently. But like, I can understand them not wanting to let American political discourse through completely, because I mean, propaganda definitely has its power. I mean, that's the reason why it's called propaganda. Like, there's a reason why propaganda has like an association with this. But I mean, I basically use propaganda to mean, and I'm pretty sure that this is the definition, and I think it, or at least it's a little bit different than this, but I basically see it as like anything supporting a political agenda in general, pushing any kind of political idea. They don't want people who, I mean, in American propaganda was definitely trying to push, it was trying to rail against socialism in a very aggressive way at the time. I mean, I can't necessarily blame them for not wanting to let it through, but there was definitely censorship in art, and there were quite a few restrictions on very personal freedoms that you could have. And I'm not talking about like private property rights or ownership of means of production, because that is not what I have an issue with. I don't have an issue with the fact that people couldn't own businesses. I mean, that people couldn't own businesses and hire workers for less than a living wage.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I mean, art is like a really big thing culturally speaking, and having censorship of art can be it's quite totalitarian. There are issues with it, and I mean, we can criticize that and still not be against socialism. The way I see it, Cuba isn't necessarily like a paradise, and it isn't particularly better than America, but it beats America in different spheres.
I think the most important thing to realize is that as soon as you defer from the fact that workers do not own rights, the means of production, you don't really have socialism. And as that's pretty quickly easy to identify in Cuba, with the curbation of civil liberties in that way, and the fact that, like you said, like he censored a lot of art that was against his or pro-American art, that it's not really a socialist country purely. But at the same time, like you said, it's important to comprehend that the socialist policies that were followed were successes, and that's been true across many socialist countries. Venezuela is another country which gets tried to. Sorry.
Which a just side note that I think should be said is that socialist policy does not inherently make a country socialist or a socialist hybrid. It's socialist policy just means that it's policy that often derives from pressure from socialists. So it's in many ways it's kind of social democratic policies, such as universal health, for example, which is something that Cuba has. That's not inherently bad just because the country is authoritarian. Doesn't mean that you need to have authoritarianism in order to have healthcare, or in order to have universal healthcare. And I mean, in a socialist society or even a communist society, which socialism and, well, all communists are socialists, but not all socialists are communists.
Yeah.
Because communism is a socialist system that abolishes currency. But I mean, in a socialist society, there would not be a price for going to the hospital. You're not going to go in debt. But I mean, also at the same time, debt wouldn't be something that really exists because you own the means of production, and you are, like, I mean, depending on the system, there are, like, I mean, there's mutualist systems. I mean, anarchism is even very diverse in what they think of communism and socialism, and how they think about dealing with like the system when it comes to laborers, people who I do use the word labor because of this theory called the abolition of work, which work basically is described or is defined in this theory as forced labor that you are forced to do. So people who do labor, I mean, there's different ways on how they deal with it. Like some people, like some anarchists some socialists still want to keep currency as like a medium of trade, but everybody has the right to like a certain amount of currency that can get them things that, like, you're not just limited to like having a hut. Like, you're not just limited to the stuff you need to survive. You can still have stuff that you enjoy in a socialist society. Like, that's not going to inherently go away because I don't know, because economic inequality still exist. You don't need economic inequality to produce an Xbox.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like going back to what you were sort of saying at the start there, like it's a complex and interesting debate, which is more than just socialism means we'll burn down the capitalist class and then it'll be done. Like, it's more to it than that. But coming back to what I was going to lead on from Cuba onto Venezuela, I see a lot of people in the West or in capitalist discourse saying, "Oh, well, look at Venezuela. They're starving now. There's famines. There's crime. That means socialism is bad." And I think
Democratic Socialist 01 made a great video on it, actually. And if you're watching, you're welcome for the shout out. But he basically, if you look at what has happened, you have to think about outside influences. A big thing with Venezuela is that their economy relied on oil. So even when it was a capitalist system, they still were poor and starving. They were poor and starving, and in fact, less people were starving under Hugo Chavez than under the capitalist system.
Well, exactly. Like, you look at their economic decisions, they exist in a capitalist world. Therefore, they have to use capitalist means of making money to sustain their own economy. Thus, they tied their economy to oil, and then once oil prices crashed, their economy crashed. But if you look,
oil prices also.
There was also U.S. manipulation. They tried to stage a coup at one point. There was FBI surveillance. Like, it wasn't just a case of socialism not working. It wasn't even full socialism because the Chavez government didn't even move them fully towards a socialist system. And the US...
No, workers did not own the means of production at all.
Yeah, it was, again, Chavez's government controlled the means of production. But
yeah, when you tie your economy to oil, that also means that because Saudi Arabia was able to drop their price of oil, people were now buying from Saudi Arabia, which meant that if Venezuela was going to sell oil, despite the fact that they were being less exploitative in how they got their oil, they were going to have to bring the price of their oil down below Saudi Arabia, which completely crashed their economy. Their economy would have been crashed whether they brought it down so that people would now buy it, because, Saudi Arabia, because they have much more of an abundance on it and their economy doesn't 100% rely on oil. However, it is also the only thing that actually ties Saudi Arabia into relations with the West is oil, but their economy isn't 100% based on oil. I mean, they're a monarchy.
Yeah.
So their system is a lot different than a normal capitalist economy in another country. So looking at Venezuela, they could not afford to drop the price in oil, but no countries were buying oil from them because it was cheaper to get it from Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia was also much more exploitative with how they obtained oil.
Yeah, well, coming back to Venezuela for a second, in agreement with what you just said there, you look at the the areas where the tenets of socialism were followed, and there was massive progress. Like, you look at how poor education was under the capitalist system, then as soon as socialism was introduced, like, literally literacy rates went up massively. The population, like the development of their system was improved hugely. Their human development index rating went up loads. they made lots of progress, and it was the areas where they stuck to the capitalist system and where they didn't follow the tenants where the society failed, and where it led to the situation we see today, where crime is higher and the population is starving. It is also worth pointing out that the capitalists are happy to condemn this crisis of starvation in Venezuela, yet when its own citizens starve in its own country, it's because of some, we didn't work hard enough, or they didn't.
You don't work hard enough. Yes, those arguments, those definitely exist, and they are some of the most annoying arguments. And I mean, even then, there are places where it's not socialist, no matter what, like, despite the fact that the Republican Party of the US keeps trying to tell you that they're socialist, in places where they've adopted more social democratic or socialist policies, with, like, even with just their schools. If you look at Sweden, they've recently abolished private schools. Just private schooling in general is not allowed. But that actually increased the education. It made the education much better, because when everybody's going to the same schools in a capitalist system, the rich people who were basically going to a private school because they wanted to make sure their kids had an even better education than that ratty public education. You know, those damn urchins going to their public schools.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at it, what happens is that now it's like, well, we still want to make sure our kids are going to great schools, even if this means other kids who aren't rich are also going to a good school because they're forced to go, or because my kid is forced to go to the same school as them. So that brings up overall education, and it's made education a lot better because they've abolished private schools. And I know that, like, the Young Turks, they'll be like, well, we don't want to abolish private schools. And I mean, I do think that liberals don't want to abolish private schools. And I do think that in America, you can definitely make education better without abolishing private schools.
Oh, easily.
But abolishing private schools would still make it better, because the rich kids would be forced to go to the public school.
It's contradictory to have claims of equal education, everyone's got a fair chance, when you're pouring proportionate amounts of money into one school from private funding, and then relying on an underfunded public school system in areas that are underfunded themselves to produce the same result. That you're naturally going to.
Public schools specifically are funded by property taxes, which means that they have to be in an area where the property is really expensive. So if you want to judge how a school is going to be, how the education is going to be, a great thing to do is to look at the properties close to it, so that you can get an idea of how much tax they're pulling from it.
Yeah.
I mean, my public school, despite the fact that the town that the school was to was a very poor town, the area around it had very high property taxes. So they actually got a decent amount of money to run the school. I mean, it was a great workaround, because it was near the outskirts of town. It was still technically in the town that I lived in, but it was in an area that was more affluent than other parts of the town. I mean, I lived in the area that was like the inner city.
Yeah.
And the property taxes weren't as high there, because the inner city usually has less expensive housing.
Yeah. Well, certainly some areas of it, the areas too.
So even public schools, not all public schools are created equal.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at, because black people happen to be in more poverty I assume all around the world in general, but in America especially.
It's in America more because of segregation, and because that still, obviously it's not segregated anymore, but the areas were largely containing black populations, so they've stayed there, or they're still black. Thus, they disproportionately have less money spent on them, and less.
Yeah, because it's paid for the property taxes from black people who are already in more poverty, which means that they're getting a shittier education due to the fact that they live in their situation. I mean, it's like you want them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but you keep cutting their bootstraps off.
Well, exactly. It's like you're telling people who your system put there in the first place, oh, well, if you work hard, you'll do well, in a system that's rigged from the start to not benefit people of less affluency. It's like,
yeah,
what do you expect is going to happen? There's not going to be as much success in those areas because you've given them less equipped schools with worse poverty rates, and then cut their funding more, as this government's planning to do. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and I mean, it's not necessarily just black people who face poor education due to their poverty. Just also areas where there are a lot more rural areas that have where the white population happens to be more poor than the general than like the rest of the white population. They also suffer because they're already poor. There's the capitalist system has already put them down there, and they can't get up because education, which is supposed to be the great equalizer, they get less of it. This is a system where the rich grow exponentially richer and the poor either stay where they are or they get even more poor.
absolutely. Like, and the rigid and angry defense of this system from people of affluency is largely it's a testament to that. They don't want to lose their status, which hands them an easier ride through life.
Well, I mean, also in general, looking at, I mean, yep. Sorry, you can go on.
I mean, and then the upper classes then feed this propaganda and this misinformation about capitalism to the lower classes, the poorer earners and working class, by essentially arguing, oh, well, look what happened to the poor in socialist Russia. They all went starving and stuff. And then they'll use that as a tool to maintain the inherently unfair system. And then you end up with people of the working class, like someone, for instance, like War Corps, to use an example, who are so pro-capitalist that they fall into almost parody. I remember debating him, and he was saying, "Oh, well, capitalism gives everyone a fair shot at innovation, and it inspires."
Well, I mean, I didn't debate him at capitalism, but I think that would have been very funny had I done that. I debated him on feminism, and that was just. You can hear him cracking cans throughout the whole video, and it's like, oh my god, like, could you at least debate me sober?
Well, I had two debates with him. One was a 4-hour one, and it was feminism initially, but I said, oh well, a female business owner has a very low chance of becoming successful, and then he was like, oh well, men do too, and I said, oh well, that's a sort of capitalism, and then he went, oh well, you hate the system that's given you everything, and it's like you can just see where it went from there, like. So, and then the second one was focused on capitalism versus socialism.
Well, my friend Red and Black Revolutionary has he's never debated him in Hangouts, but he has in the past he did debates back and forth on like an anarcho-communism system versus his neocon capitalist system, and I mean it's quite funny. My friend, of course, he's open about his name, so I'm not doxing him here. Jake, that's his real name. He basically so Jake essentially, like in a couple of hangouts, he's basically said, I'm still waiting for Workworks' 600th installment of Communism Doesn't Fucking Work.
Well, it's true. He just like parrots all these statements about socialism and communism that make it obvious that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Like he
I got him in my debate about feminism with him. I got him to admit that he has never read any feminist theory.
Oh,
that
this is a nice segue into feminism, by the way.
Yeah. It's like, well, I kind of thought about that. I'm like, well, I mean, that was like the main admission that I wanted to get when I went into the Hangout. Like, even if I like absolutely sucked at the debate, which you could actually see the debate on my channel, I did, in my own opinion, suck at the debate because it wasn't a very formal debate. It was a YouTube style debate.
Mm.
But but yeah, I mean, but I got him to admit that he has not read any feminist theory, so he does not know what the feminists are advocating for academically, and he just sees things through the lens of the anti-feminist.
Mm.
Someone who's, which, I mean, the lens of an anti-feminist is often not looking at a feminist themselves, but looking at a second-hand account or a third-hand account. Often it's an account, like, for someone like War Corpse, it's an account of 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 a feminist.
Yeah. Like, you look at, he'll say things like, oh, feminists achieved equality 100 years ago when we got the right to vote. Like, and then he'll also say that, oh, well, first and second wave feminists are good, but we're all right, but third wave feminists are bad. Well, if he's saying that they got equality in 1922 or whatever, but then he's also saying that second wave feminists are good, then
Emma
he's
Goldman,
himself, because
Emma Goldman would Emma Goldman would laugh at that statement that women achieved equality in 1920 when they got the right to vote.
Well, because he ignores black women for one, and it's such a laughable concept for two. But...
yeah, segregation was still going on too. So
yeah, but again, he throws out all these like blank, void of any reasoning statements.
There were still black people in areas that weren't allowed to vote, and then there were black women, especially, who were victims of both misogyny and segregation.
Well, exactly. But then you go,
so it was definitely an intersection there.
Yeah, but then to a person like War Corpse, intersectionality is too, like, it's not something he wants to tackle. It's like I remember once he did a 20-minute video response to a comment I left on one of his videos, and it comes to the point about a Mexican feminist, and he's ranting on about, oh, there's no such thing as black feminism, there's no such thing as Islamic feminism, and it's like, you've not read anything about it, you don't know anything about it, and you just like spewing out nonsense based on preconceptions and buzzwords.
Intersectionality was literally founded by a black female socialist who basically believed in this idea of intersecting forms of oppression. And I mean, I think as anarchy, like, because anarchy has this tendency to question all hierarchies and asks for hierarchies to justify themselves, we definitely I think anarchists should definitely look at intersectionality and see how these different hierarchies intersect for people who fall under multiple hierarchies and who aren't at the top of any of them, or who are at the top of one but at the bottom of several others.
Well, exactly.
Like, sure, I mean, I am a white guy, even though like I'm like ever so slightly, like, I get a little bit of non-white in me, but I mean, I'm still, like, people look at me, they're not going to see a Native American or a black guy. They're going to see a white guy. So, I mean, I have the privilege of walking down the street and knowing that I'm not going to be the victim of a chokehold from a police officer. Like, even in my dealings with the police, which haven't always been positive, I haven't been killed yet. That's more than I can say for Trayvon and Eric Garner. Or actually, Trayvon wasn't with the police, but
well, exactly.
That is way
more odds of being the victim of crimes or abuse or discrimination are far lower if you are a white man.
However, I am pansexual, which means that I do have I am seen as inferior in society due to the fact that I am not straight. I have a lot of prejudice due to the fact that I am not straight. Of course, that one isn't necessarily as out in the open as like the amount of melanin in your skin.
Yeah.
But if you're open about it, you can see a lot of problems stem from it. even
Exactly.
just the suggestion that someone might be gay can be pretty damaging
Yeah.
because of how society perceives it.
Like there's always like preconceptions like in people's minds. Even some of the most progressive people still have innate like little societal discriminations built into them from an early age, which goes against them. And that's why I think it's important for opponents of capitalism to also include feminist theory and anti-discrimination theory and social justice within their works, because to fully understand why it's a bad system, you have to look at the oppressed groups and those who aren't benefiting from a privilege in more ways than one. Hence why intersectionality and other topics is so important. And hence why to be an opponent of capitalism, you also, I think, have to be a feminist, really.
Yeah. Are you familiar with this channel called Operation Anarchism? Because I do. I mean, I used to be part of this like platform that they started, but I mean, basically, like the guy's very brocialist, and some of the things he says about intersectionality, you can tell that he clearly hasn't actually read intersectionality theory, and he clearly doesn't understand it. He claimed that it was a special interest splinter of Marxism that started intersectionality. Like, oh, there are special interest groups.
I'm not aware of this person, but I mean, from the
Yeah.
sound of it, I don't really need to be,
Oh,
do I?
this person also, well, I mean, I don't think you can necessarily call it doxing, but the intent was to dox me, where he basically showed my face and my name in a video, my real name. Of course, my real name, I had already said it on my channel, so I mean, and he, like, it, also the way that he had done it, it seemed pretty clear that he hadn't actually paid attention to my channel at all. Like he didn't know this, like but he tried to make it seem like he was doxing me. And
Yeah.
so I basically said, well, I was technically doxed because someone was trying to dox me. Someone's intent was to have like my identity exposed so that people could threaten me. Of course, nothing has come out of it because the guy's got such a small channel. The guy has no audience, no like he has no base to actually attack people with. But I mean, if this guy had like a Bering-sized audience, you bet I would have gotten millions of death threats by now.
Mm.
Maybe not millions, but thousands.
A lot, yeah. Like,
I've gotten more harassment from Bering, and I've barely gotten I've gotten barely a fraction of the harassment from Bering fans that other feminists on the internet have. Like, so the harassment from like if you look at Bering, a lot of what his channel functions as is it functions to harass people. In many ways, I mean, it's not about rational discourse because if you look at it, he never has an actual argument. The closest the closest semblance to an argument is "fuck you, you're a fuckhead," "kill yourself, you cunt," stuff like that.
well, I think the
Intellectual arguments. That is totally what Bering
yeah.
does.
Well, I mean, you look at his videos and you'll see, you'll see the initial thumbnail is a good precursor to what's going to be in the video, and it'll be like a face of them, maybe not, like out when they're mid sentence, they'll be like going duh or racist or like retard or something. And whilst Bering himself, obviously, he's not going to say, "Oh, go and harass on camera." The language he uses against the people in the videos is a precursor to that. So and in one of his videos, he calls a feminist he's criticizing a dumb broad, and he's like showing her no respect as a person. And not obviously like you don't have to agree with her arguments, but if you don't show respect to a person, then his fans are going to follow suit. And
yeah, if you don't show respect to the person, your fans like, especially if you leave the link in there, your fan like, I mean, I haven't left the link to the video mainly because I'm like a lazy bastard when it comes to writing out my descriptions. But like when I do like link, like if I were to link a video, I'm going to make sure that I'm showing respect to the person because I don't want my audience to go and harass this person because he has the wrong impression. Like, I don't want to, but I mean, yeah, it's like, if you're showing respect to the person knows that clearly you don't want them to go over. There still might be a few people who go over, but I mean, it's the difference between a few people and thousands of people who go over to Dogpile.
Well, that's the thing as well. Like, you look at the people who go over, you know, well, I'll finish. Sorry. You look at the fact that like 3,000 people will turn up to like a comment section of like a person with 20 subscribers or something, and they'll be throwing at her like, why is feminism wrong because of this, or feminism is bad because of this. And yeah, maybe not all of them are saying the horrible stuff, but not only are you ignoring the fact that plenty of his fans are be saying the worst things to her, but then could you reasonably expect someone to answer like 100 of like different forms of feminism is bad because this woman did something bad, or feminism is bad because of these stats that I've not explained?
Yeah, feminism is bad because Lena Dunham. It's like, whilst I don't like Lena Dunham, and I mean, part of it has to do with the fact that she molested her sister, but I mean, also she's like a total white feminist. Like, she kind of rejects a lot of concepts of intersectionality at the same time. And I mean, I basically said, like, I made my opinion clear on YouTube, which meant that I got both hatred from people who claim to be feminists, and I got hatred from Baring fans, because it's like, how dare you compare Baring to someone who molested her sister? And then it's like, because of Baring's constant harassment and the fact that he threatened to dox Danny Corks. And then, of course, you get the Baring fans who believe that Danny Corks and Christy Winters orchestrated the dox. And it's like, well, if you're actually against doxing, you wouldn't, like, I mean, I'm against the doxing in most cases, but there's like the occasional situation where you have no other recourse. And then in those situations, I don't think I can really judge someone for doxing if there's no other recourse.
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about the situation to talk about it, though, like, as in, like, I literally don't know anything about it, really, or enough.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying, though, like, you wouldn't, like, it's like, oh, well, if Danny Corks and Christy Winters actually doxed him, like, he could like, it would make more sense if he was trying to make a case with the police to say, like, hey, this person released my information online in an attempt to harass me.
No, I know, like, it's a ludicrous situation. But going to what you were saying about Lena Dunham and that brand of feminism, I mean, I think that I do get annoyed with the I guess I call it liberal feminism, like the sort of feminism aimed exclusively at issues that affect a small band of population. And I think the problem that feminism, or a lot of people criticizing feminism, are criticizing this brand of feminism, which is like very small issues perpetuated by people like Amy Schumer, and there's another one. I can't remember her name, but people who are, sorry?
Emma Watson?
Sort of her, but not her as much. But
not as much. Which, it's funny because, like, with a lot of these people, I don't necessarily hate them, but like, their brand of feminism can kind of tick me off, where it's like, it's too single issue. It's just,
there's no wide scale criticism, thus it's very easy to like portray it as this just like elitist version of privileged people complaining about small things, when in fact there's far more to a feminist argument, and even the points they're talking about aren't necessarily wrong, but because they're so exclusively focused on stuff that doesn't really affect the majority of the population, it's easy to dismiss it as elitist feminist bullshit, as people call it.
Well, I mean, even then, I've met a lot of people who, whilst they describe that they hate this the most, at the same time, they seem to get pissed off at intersectional arguments too, calling it SJW bullshit and stuff like that. Like, and they will even be like, oh, well, I hate the intersectional feminism even more than I hate this feminism, because the intersectional feminism combines all the elitist issues into one, and it's like I mean, in many ways, it seems like a lot of people who have issues or who have issues with society don't want to look at the possibility that other people may have issues that they want to deal with that you should care about. I mean, if you're my comrade, I'm going to help you fight for all of your issues, not just the ones that I share with you.
Exactly. Like a good movement isn't it's got many policies and has many aspects to work on and operate on.
Yeah.
It's not like I get annoyed when I hear people saying like, oh, you want us to focus on this and this, and like complaining that policies are there's too many policies, and it's like, well, no, that's not how a good political system works.
Well, I mean, brocialism especially, like that. I mean, brocialism pisses me off just as much as like white bourgeois feminism, where it's kind of focused on elite white women who still have issues compared to elite white men. It's kind of like I have the same issue when it comes to brocialists, where it's kind of people who don't care about any other issue other than class struggle. That's kind of like, well, no, there are more issues than class struggles. Than just the class struggle. I mean, look at Catalonia, for example. If you look at Catalonia, there was a group that formed called Las Mujeres Libres, which translates from Spanish to English as free women. And this group formed as an anarcho-feminist group because of the fact that there was still discrimination against women in a society that had gotten rid of class and gotten rid of, so it got rid of both class and, oh, wow, that was the first yawn in an hour. But yeah, no, it got rid of class. It got rid of both class and the state, but there were still systemic problems in there. And I mean, also a lot of people who try to claim that there isn't a systemic problem with women, just because there isn't out and out legal discrimination against women, there's more systems than just the legal system. Culture in itself is a system. And it seems like a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that. When I say that there's systemic issues, I don't mean, I'm not talking about the legal system always. I'm talking about issues with other systems, such as culture. I mean, culturally, we portray women as frail, weak.
Well, exactly. Like, you said, the legal system like is one metric, but as you said, like it's not just that. Like, racism didn't end the second the Civil Rights Act was just signed. Like, it's not like every single white person in the country was like,
If you ask the Tea Party, they would differ. They would beg to differ. Racism. As soon as we signed the Civil Rights Act, I mean, the KKK disbanded and realized they were defeated. Oh, wait.
Exactly. It's like people who view racism as literally the KKK and sexists as just these like rapists who hang around in alleyways and stuff. So they're missing the point. Like, there's more to a society than just laws. There's, as you said, culture and media, and especially in today's world, like the world of the internet and media culture plays into our viewing of society. And linking back to you said at the start, socialism, people who only focus on class struggle, it's like, well, you're ignoring the elements of society which capitalism helps to enforce, like sexism. You look at how women aren't really, like, they're not at the top of corporations, really. They're not earning the most money, and as a result, we've got these perpetuated lies about women being not assertive and not able to dominate a workplace, or how
and that still persists even amongst, and I mean, that stereotype persists even amongst people who claim to be anti-capitalists to an extent. The idea that women aren't assertive, but I mean, I would argue that women may be less assertive, but it would only be due to the fact that we have socialized them that way, not because it's inherent in their biology or anything like that.
Absolutely. There's no inherent qualities to a specific gender. Every person is different. You can't, it'd be silly to judge people based on their gender. Another old War Corps saying, actually no, I was going to bring in something War Corps was saying about sexism. He thinks that his reason women don't make it to the top is because of life choices and they get pregnant, and that actually ties into another socialist point, actually, that the raising of children and working as a parent at home,
it's valuable. Capitalism has deemed it
exactly
as invaluable, despite the fact that it is one of the most important aspects of perpetuating society. We still see it. Capitalists still see it, or capitalist society still sees it as we still see it in capitalist society as like
it's
not valuable.
It's not valuable.
Yeah, it's kind of like people ask you, why don't you just do what you want to do? Like, why don't you like your job? I don't like my job because what I like to do and what I would like to do for work has been deemed poor people's work, or it has been deemed not as valuable as the work that I'm doing. I mean,
And
a lawyer being a lawyer is a dreadfully boring job from at least from where I'm sitting. It seems like it would be a dreadfully boring job. But people do that because that has been deemed as like a very valuable job by capitalism.
And
where I'd much rather prefer to be a carpenter over that, because a carpenter at least gets to work with their hands and stay active to some extent.
Well, I mean, I think the choices everyone has as an individual, what they want to do, will always be undermined by a capitalist system where choice is not valued over profit. But I was just thinking, actually, that there is a way which laws and legal systems hurt women. The Republican government and right-wing governments cut benefits and housing benefits and maternity leave and stuff. And these things are more used by women. And because they're
just because it doesn't affect exclusively women doesn't mean it doesn't affect women more.
Exactly. And because more mothers than fathers will look after the child in the early stages of their life, this predominantly affects women when you cut these benefits. So the law and legal systems do, in fact, negate the progress of women in society. Though I guess if you're a capitalist, you don't believe in state benefits anyway. So
I think you're missing the point. The woman can choose to not take care of the child. It was her choice. It's kind of like a great example from libertarian socialist rants that I always use is you're in the middle of the desert and you are dying of dehydration, and someone comes across and offers you a bottle of water, but at the same time they say, if I give you this bottle of water, you have to do work for me for the rest of your life. Like you essentially have to be my slave. Or you have to give me I think what he said was, you have to give me £1 million, and you may not have the £1 million, but you put it on credit, and you are in debt for the rest of your life because you wanted to make sure that you survive. It's not really voluntary when the choice is pay an excessive amount of money or die. I mean, when it comes to working, it's like, well, it's not much of a choice if you either work a job that capitalism deems valuable, or you live in poverty.
Well, exactly.
I mean, you have to, like, oh, why weren't you an engineer instead of this? Like, oh, why didn't you graduate high school? Like, you can't blame people for the fact that, I mean, also in many cases, like, a lot of the jobs that have been deemed more valuable require more education, which costs more money, which can actually mean that someone who gets a job that does require that degree, but maybe doesn't pay as much money as something like a lawyer, they're in debt for the rest of their life from student loans.
Yeah.
they still live in poverty despite the fact that they may have a job that's even considered relatively high end.
Yeah. And that argument annoys me as well, because it essentially, not only does it admit that it's curbing the knowledge of other sectors simply because it doesn't like attain profit, but then if you have all the people choosing, in quotation marks, the right degree or the right diploma, then all of a sudden the market is overfilled, and now there's too many engineers. So there's a whole group of people who have these excellent degrees and are qualified to earn a lot of money, but then don't, and they end up working in McDonald's.
You can get an engineer. Yeah, you can end up getting an engineering degree, and then it's like, well, you could get a fucking PhD in engineering, and it's like, well, I can't get any other job, so now I have to go and work at McDonald's, or I have to go and work at, or I mean, also like, especially like if you're vegan like I am, you have to. It's like, I have to go and cook beef when I find the exploitation of animals to be reprehensible. Like I take part in the system that exploits animals in factory farms for profit.
Just even like jobs which they're severely underqualified for, or sorry, overqualified for, like losing their potential in society. Like capitalism curbs productivity by exploiting people and ignoring the profits of others.
Hey, Owen, why did you get a liberal arts degree? You should have gotten a real degree.
Well, yeah, that's such a bad argument. It's like, in what kind of society do we live in where supposedly having more knowledge is a bad thing because it's the wrong knowledge? It's like, well, it's not an ideal state of being.
Yeah, it's clearly not an ideal state of being. The idea that you have to have you also, again, if you choose the right job, you still need the people who do the jobs that are considered low paying in society, such as, all right, yeah, sorry, that was my grandmother. She was letting me know that she's headed to the bank. But so yeah, I mean, you still need people who have the low paying jobs in society, such as like janitorial duties, like picking stuff up. I mean, that's still something that needs to be done in society if you have a capitalist system. So then it's kind of like everybody getting the right degree doesn't fix the problem. Because now the world's just filled with engineers and lawyers, and there's not enough positions because we don't have anybody in lower positions.
Exactly. It's capitalism has effectively admitted that it can't maintain a productive working populace. Hence why it curbs the potential productivity of so many of its citizens to pretend that it's got a working market. And that's a sad state of being, and we need to change that, I feel.
Yeah, that's why socialism.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, just generally looking at it. So we just went from socialism to feminism and back to socialism.
That's very true. But I mean, the two are kind of linked. Like I certainly see it as
yeah. Well, I mean, I see all the issues that we're talking about as linked. I mean, yeah. Also, like I mean, I like a lot of people in the social justice community, and I think the social justice community is great. But I think that sometimes they can fall into like very liberal and anti-communist arguments.
In what way?
Just and so like you kind of get people who like are like, well, no, you have to have the Senate, and we still have to have the job market. You still have to have the boss, and it's not everybody in the social justice community, as the social justice community is diverse. But I mean, it's like while you have the more progressive-minded people, the more progressive-minded people as opposed to the like socialist-minded people, they may be a bit more apprehensive about socialist concepts. I mean,
well, I think a lot of people, certainly in the States, are always going to be a little bit not as like naive about it, but like less informed. Thus, they won't speak about it as much, and thus they'll focus purely on the paradigms of feminism without necessarily touching socialism. But I mean, unless I think a lot of people can be sort of won over and convinced by it if you just
Oh yeah,
like.
I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm just saying that this sometimes happens, is that because of our capitalist society, it's so ingrained that even people who want progress don't necessarily think about capitalism.
But no, there certainly needs to be more discourse about anti-capitalism in society, because it's how you explain a lot. It's how, I mean, I recently did a video on this, but it's how, in my opinion, someone like Donald Trump was able to rise to the presidency, because he exploited the lack of attention being given to the working class that had been exploited by capitalism. He made his campaign one of anti anti-globalization, anti-elitism, and regardless of the validity of that, and obviously it wasn't valid at all, and it was laced with lots of anti-immigration, and obviously he's a terrible person individually, but the message was good. And next to Hillary Clinton, who's very much the figure of the neoliberal Democrat Party, it's easy to see why so many like working class citizens and people in Pennsylvania and Iowa and Michigan and likewise.
Well, I mean, if you live in a society that teaches you that immigrants are taking your jobs, and you hear Donald Trump say, we need to stop immigration because the immigrants are taking your jobs, that just reinforces that idea that you already had. So that lie that was there, it's not the immigrants taking your jobs or pushing down your wages. In fact, it's your bosses pushing down your wages. It's
Exactly.
taking away your jobs. It's your bosses going and giving your jobs to illegal immigrants who they can pay less because they're not considered citizens of the country.
Exactly.
It's your boss. And I mean, also, I recently saw a meme that I thought was really funny where like one of my biggest issues with capitalism comes with the question of automation. And so this was a meme. I think Kevin Logan actually shared it on Facebook. It was him who shared it that I saw it, and it said, "See, these immigrants taking your jobs seem." Or it says, "I don't mean to be racist, but these immigrants taking our jobs seem to all look the same, and it's a bunch of robot arms." So it's talking about automation. Like it's not actually like we're not talking about actual people taking your jobs. In many cases, things are just becoming automated. Of course, how it should be in society is if things are getting automated, is it's like, woohoo, I can do something else that I like doing, or I can just decide to not work and find a hobby or find busy work that I do. Like I can work. Ironically, you could work at your own leisure in this society after your job gets automated. Like, well, it's like my job position. There's no need for people in that position anymore because that field is getting automated. So now I can do something else with my life, and I can even choose not to work if I don't want to anymore because I don't have to worry about my income. But in capitalist society, you have to worry about your job being lost because that job was the source of your food. That job was.
Instead, an automated factory lays off thousands of workers and puts communities into poverty and stress. To people who are so, oh, well, immigrants change our way of life, they change our cultures. Not only is that wrong and obviously prejudice and stuff, but if they really wanted to stop immigration, they need to look at the factors as to why someone would leave their country of birth or country of residence to move to another country. And it stems from capitalism itself. The US has made itself the center of the world, so it's natural that people want to move from other countries to there to work because there's higher wages and there's better economic chances for a person living there. Like capitalism creates the inequality, which pulls people away, pushes people towards the United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's also quite ironic at the same time because at the same time we still in America we also created like beyond just making things want to. Or besides just making things better for the citizens, I mean, for one, it was socialists who specifically got the policies through that actually improved things, which makes it quite ironic. But also, whilst making itself the center of capitalism, we have also made ourselves the center of imperialism, screwing up other countries, therefore making people want to leave at every chance that they get.
Yeah,
I can't blame them.
exactly. Well, it's certainly you can't blame anyone who wants to leave a country that the US's foreign policy has helped to disrupt and destroy.
Yeah. So in other words, they have no other choice but to go to the States, because otherwise they don't know what's going to happen with their life.
Yeah.
Things could be all right, but at the same time, things might not be all right. They might not be as all right as people think. You don't know. In a lot of these places, you have to live day to day. You don't know. One day is fine, and the next day you've got a bullet in your head from a U.S. soldier, because the U.S. has decided that this country is not friendly enough to American interests.
Well, exactly.
And the key there being enough, because they can still be friendly to American interests, and then America's like, well, they're not friendly enough to our interests, so we have to go and we have to get them as friendly as possible to our interests.
Well, I mean,
in many ways, it makes me think of the scene from Futurama with Bender, where he basically says, he's living in, I mean, in many ways, I'd probably compare it to like a primitivist society, referring to like anarcho-primitivism. In a society where they've basically gotten rid of any advanced technology, and he's made out of wood now, and he says, we must spread our peaceful ways by force.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean,
yeah, he tries to talk about peace, and it's like, we've got to spread our peaceful ways by force. It's contradictory.
It was spelled out quite clearly by the Bush administration with the whole us versus them thing, where they literally just said, you are with us or you are against us. And that's the telling example of the US's foreign policy being very much side of America or we'll crush you and we'll ruin your country, and install some puppet who will play to our whims to benefit themselves. And a massive lie you hear about capitalism is how it's helped, it's raised so many people out of poverty. And when you take a closer look at the countries that have supposedly been saved from poverty, you realize that this is a total fabrication. So you hear people say, oh,
the argument capitalism got people or countries out of poverty, I'd call that the Paul Joseph Watson argument, because he basically argued that the reason Chile is rich is because capitalism. And, it's not because they're in the pockets of imperialists and they have basically played the game correctly.
And then you take a closer look at their population and you look at people who died because of the American interference in Chile, because of the Pinochet government and the coup. But Paul Joseph Watson,
but a socialist of all people would appreciate free helicopter rides.
Oh God. But you look at Paul Joseph Watson talking about how great Southeast Asia has become because of capitalism, and then you look at how the working class is treated there, and it's atrocious. Like the argument that China is no longer in poverty because they left communism and went to capitalism. Not only did they not have communism, they had Maoism, which again is not the workers' only means of production, so therefore not a form of socialism or communism. But then the working class have they don't have the right to strike. They have very poor working conditions. They're essentially tied to their jobs in like almost like slave-like conditions, and they literally live on proximities run by the corporations. There's no tax regulations basically, and workers literally put nets outside the factories to stop workers from committing suicide at the.
So you mean to tell me that Ancapistan is not a paradise?
Oh God. I know it's such a staggering shock, isn't it? That
yeah, I know. I'm shocked right now. I can't believe, like, what can go wrong if you don't tax anybody in a capitalist system, if you just let capitalism run wild and eat itself. Who knew that it would basically make things 10 times worse?
But then the thing that happens is they highlight the upper class in China, which, because China is a massive country, is still a fair amount of people. And they say, oh, well, look at these people. China's a growing success. And they'll look at some skyscrapers in Shanghai or Beijing, and it's like, oh, well, China's now this economic paradise where we've perfected capitalism. And it's yet again focusing on the elite few who have benefited and ignoring the working masses who have been treated like cattle and tools to further the advances of the rich. The same thing happens in Africa, where in countries like Nigeria, the economy is large because there's a lot of people, and there's thus a massive upper and higher middle class. But there's still a huge swelling of working class people who have not seen any benefits, are treated again like cogs in a capitalist machine, and thus are ignored and treated terribly. And this is the same in any of the countries that the US has financially helped out or has become capitalist. And it's sad that these workers are nothing but a false example of this supposed successes of capitalism.
Well, I mean, in many cases too, in places where, like in quote developing countries, because that term can be a bit problematic. In many of these places, so in many of these places, it was relatively nice, like compared to like what it is before the introduction of capitalism into these areas. It was a nice, like it was much better for the workers than it was after the introduction of capitalism. They were not being exploited the way that they are after the introduction of capitalism. So capitalism has made the conditions for lower class people worse.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Like, because the vision of supposed poverty for many people is just, oh, well, they're not in modern buildings, they're not in our way of life. And it's a very imperialistic colonial view of the Western powers structure of society being the correct one and any other form as being inferior. Hence why supposedly living in non-traditional like huts or wigwams or whatever is bad. But then you look what we've been transferred into, and it's like these terrible housing conditions. There's these massive buildings with awful conditions, and it's like, well, how have you improved these people's lives? And then not only that, but some of these places even have like private militia like forces and private armies the TNCs use to control their working populace and to literally stamp out any sort of worker dissent. It's atrocious. Well, it's like,
first I was living in a hut that actually kept me sheltered and kept me cool, and now I'm living in a house that's in shambles. And mind you, I didn't pay for the hut. I just made the hut and I got to keep it. But now under capitalism, I am living in a house that is in shambles and it's leaky and everything.
And but if I raise my voice, then I'll get filtered out.
Yeah, but I also have to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, that's another lie as well. The idea of, oh, well, under socialism, the government's going to take all your stuff away and you'll be a slave to the system, ignoring the fact that under capitalism, your land is owned by a landlord and you pay them. Otherwise, they'll take your stuff away and take your house away. It's like the hypocrisy is beyond belief and the lies.
Yeah, and I mean, also, even if you buy a house, there's the mortgage that you have to pay. If you're unable to keep up with the mortgage because you stumble upon tough times money-wise, the bank takes your house away in a process called foreclosure.
Especially in a country like America, where you also have to pay for your healthcare, and if you like have a severe injury, it's either often for many people it's your house or your life. Like, hence why so many people are homeless in capitalist countries. Something which is also ignored by government a lot.
Yep, I mean, if it wasn't for my grandmother, I mean, I do pay rent, but I pay a lot cheaper rent than I would if I was actually living somewhere else. If it wasn't for my grandmother, I'd be part of the homeless statistic of the US.
Mm. Well, exactly. Like it's worrying how easy someone can fall into the system. Homelessness has increased every year since the Conservative government took office in the United Kingdom, which I find to be like astounding. Whilst the economy is rising too, the Conservatives are saying at the moment, "Oh, well, we're doing such a good job because the economy is going. We're doing a better job running the country than Labour did." And for all the faults that the new Labour system had, they didn't have the homeless crisis that we're seeing in the UK now. The government wages are falling whilst the economy is rising. That shows you that the capitalist class are seizing money for themselves and then claiming that, oh, well, we're successful because the economy is booming, whilst there's more homeless people on the streets. It is shocking.
Yeah, well, I mean, also a lot of the things that are used to basically judge whether the economy is booming or not, a lot of that is basically just stuff that judges how the rich are doing. It doesn't judge how the lower class is doing because the lower class isn't even taken into account.
Exactly.
So when the rich are doing good, it's seen as the economy is doing great. Like if you use the stock market as an example of the economy booming, well, the stock market only tells us how rich people do, and the occasional person who is gutsy enough to actually take a loan and risk going into severe financial debt for the rest of their life just to take a crack at the stock market.
And then,
But I mean, it's only rich people, really. Like, that's the majority of people who buy stocks. That tells us how the rich are doing. It doesn't tell us how the poor are doing. And then we also have more empty houses than we have homeless people.
exactly, yeah. And
which means that if we put homeless people in every one of these houses, we'd still have houses left over. And you're telling me that we've got a great system?
it's the same with all. There's food to feed everyone, but it just gets thrown away. There's goods to provide for everyone. There's energy for everyone. The world is not like it's. Yeah, people say, "Oh, overpopulation's an issue," but it doesn't need to be. Like if you redistributed wealth and resources, then it wouldn't be at all.
Well, I mean, also with just generally in society, or just generally when it comes to this is actually a conundrum that only capitalism has a reason for this being the case, but it actually costs the state more due to the healthcare bills and stuff like that they are forced to pick up because this person doesn't even have like a bank account because a hospital isn't allowed to turn someone away because of lack of money. So even homeless people who end up in the hospital get treatment, but because they don't even have a bank account for you to take money from them and indebt them and say that they owe money, it costs the state money because the state has to pick up the tab. Well, it costs the state more money under that system to keep people homeless than it would if they just paid for the homes that are being foreclosed. If they just paid for the homes and said, "Here, you homeless people can live in these homes."
Exactly.
Yeah, we've solved the housing crisis. Everybody has now. Everybody has somewhere to live. And it also cost us less money than it did to keep you guys on the streets. But because capitalist business interests say, well, no, we want money, which, I mean, I find it quite funny because at the same time, technically capitalist business interests in the scenario that I just played out would still get the money. They just get the money from the state and from tax dollars. Oh, but then it's like the citizens are like, well, we don't want to be paying for these people's house. Well, do you want to be paying for these people to be forced to stay on the street? Like, do you want to pay extra money? Like, you want to pay extra money for healthcare just to spite the poor people, where you could actually pay less money for healthcare if you just if it was paid with your tax dollars.
Well,
but see, in capitalism, this is the only system where it actually makes sense that you would pay more money to make things worse.
Yep.
You know, you could pay less money just to give the guy a fucking house, but, you know, capitalism, you've got to keep him on the street, even though it costs the taxpayer a lot more.
Well,
and I mean, I'm also saying that we should, and I'm also not even saying, obviously, that we should be, and that we shouldn't be paying for homeless people's health care. We obviously should. But I mean, when it clearly would increase their quality of life with also the backwards effect of also just generally making it less expensive overall to give the guy a house to live in. It just makes sense to give the guy a house.
Yeah.
Even if it's paid for it.
If you look at the lack of logic in many capitalist systems, you'll be here for days. And I'm very sorry, I have to go in a few minutes. So we could think of curving this towards a conclusion of some sort.
Well, the conclusion is capitalism must die.
If you couldn't tell already.
Capitalism must die, patriarchy must die, racism must die, and even if this means that you have to violently defend people who are marginalized, you must still fight regardless.
I think in times like this, it's important to take like a political proper stance, because you if you take the in quotation marks moderate position, if you allow for these fascists and the far right to gain mobilization, then you risk the same situation that we saw in.
Before you go, I don't know why I didn't think about this, because we were talking about MLK. Oh wait, yeah, that's right, because history doesn't teach about this other guy. And I'm not talking about Malcolm X. I'm talking about this guy who was another civil rights leader with MLK. This was Bayard Rustin. He was a gay black man, but he was also because we were talking about how Martin Luther King was a socialist. He was actually a member of the U.S. Communist Party. Early on in his life, and even later on in his life, up until just before he started to die, or just before he, I say started to die, just before he, in his later years, he was no longer part of the Communist Party, but he was in the Communist Party for most of his life, which is something that often gets ignored. And Kat Black actually did a good video on Bayard Rustin.
Well, I'll have to have a look at him more, because I wasn't very aware of him. So he sounds like a very intriguing person. But yeah, it's telling that certain activists are not given public awareness as much, and it's worrying.
Well, I mean, especially since he was openly gay in a time where it was illegal to be gay. So a lot of people have been, despite the fact that he was actually very prominent, he kind of got erased from history books because people didn't want to talk about the gay guy who helped black people get civil rights, because out of this fear that it would taint the movement. But yeah, it's very important to not be a moderate, because the moderate position capitulates to the far right, capitulates to the oppressors. If you don't, inaction is just as bad as negative action in this scenario.
Exactly. And as we mentioned earlier, history shows us that if we allow concessions and normalization of these people and their beliefs, then we risk more than what would happen if we took a fighting stance and a physical, proactive stance against them.
Yeah. So it was nice talking to you, Owen, and
definitely.
I hope I didn't take too much of your time.
Not at all. It's been really refreshing talking to someone of a like mind. So,
All right. Well, I am. Oh, I forgot that I actually can stop the broadcast. Well, I will have a new video out this week. I will see you all later.